the web app of this does not have sharing, so I guess that's something to know for future reference. Okay, can you see my screen now?
Yeah.
All right, cool. So you've seen most of this. This is a modified version of the presentation I showed you last time. So let me just run down this really quick to get to the new part. Do you need any refresher about anything, or shall I just get started with the new stuff?
Bob?
I've been listening to the Ramones and the Clash nonstop since your last presentation, so I'm good.
So we're probably good.
Very cool. So, right, and do my outline and my rough drafts and everything. I have focused on several different areas, several different specific concepts and topics. One thing in particular fascination is industrial music, first and second wave industrial music, specifically in England and Europe, and how that relates to my overall thesis. So my thesis is about how the built environment shaped different music subcultures, music genres, and everything. One thing that I found interesting is a lot of the musicians and bands don't really respond directly to any kind of larger concept in the built environment. Punk would say criticize the suburbs, more certain things that related to the environment they existed in. And they would write about things like squatting and kind of the politics and all that. But there's no overall kind of philosophy or law systemic critique of the built environment among most of these genres. Industrial music, however, is a really interesting and unique exception. So it provides a really fascinating case study. And I want to use that chapter and some of the ideas that are brewing for that one as a way to demonstrate how I'm going to make my argument, because it just stands out so much. So this is going to be the sample chapter and subsections to how it's constructed. It's going to start with an overview of music and a short history of it, focusing on some important influences such as William S. Burroughs, a beat author, and Italian futurism, both of which had a huge influence on industrial music. Going into the history of industrial, it's interesting to know that as a musical genre, it had very few musical influences. Industrial, for those who don't know, is a music genre that today is thought of as kind of abrasive electronic dance music, mostly mixing guitars and elements of what would seem like techno or electronic, but it started out as something very different. It was more like performance art, more abstract and ambient. The first industrial band, Throbbing Gristle, was originally an avant-garde performance art group called Coombe Transmissions, and they did things like gallery shows. They didn't list a lot of music influences, but they did list performance artists and literary influences. So this is a musical genre that emerged out of something other than music. So that in itself is really interesting. What's especially fascinating about industrial is that it takes on the built environment and the urban environment that it existed in a much more direct way. So once the part of the chapter about the origins is out of the way, I'm going to be talking about 70s England specifically. As it's a little bit known how 70s England influenced punk music with the built environment, political context, the urban decay and the strikes, and how this sense of despair and kind of like the no future ethos. Industrial responded to that as well, with bands like Throbbing Gristle and Voltaire taking note of that, but instead of kind of pushing back against it, they analyze it in a more detached way. They want their music to be a reflection of their environment and kind of a more embodied and metabolic way. The sounds that would bring to mind the sounds they would hear walking around an urban environment. It's mostly with sampling, highly distorted guitars, electric and bass, synthesizers, and they're just kind of like abstract, throbbing, ambient soundscapes and kind of smooth, weird electronic progressions. So the music was not made to the conventional songs per se, but more like sound collages using instruments and non-instrumental sources that, at least in their view, was making some kind of commentary on their surrounding environment and what it was all about. So I think that's a particularly interesting thing to study for the book, the overall argument. And when what industrial is, what sets it apart from other genres, the influence of William Burroughs and futurism, because if you read a lot of the studies of industrial and a lot of the interviews, and there's a huge amount of interviews with these early figures, Burroughs especially is one person I keep coming back to. His cut-up technique influenced the music, how they made it, their approach to it, their deconstruction of music, and their kind of philosophy of anti-music. They had very much an idea of bringing the art world to the music world, and their idea of anti-music and performance art. There are multiple waves of industrial music. I concern myself mostly with the first two waves because those are the most relevant to what I'm doing. Give a basic history. Wave 1 focus on the band Throbbing Gristle, which I mentioned before, came out of a performance art band. There's a picture of him over to the right. Their philosophy, their approach, their relevance to the overall argument, examples in music and performance. So a lot of this is really interesting, as they sought not just to create sound, and to create very visual, very lively, and very unusual performances. They use graphic arts, and which was in their terms propaganda, to kind of communicate their idea of analyzing the industrial environment they were in and breaking down conventional ideas and getting people to question things through shock and through unusual concepts and imagery, which in their kind of approach was about kind of shocking people and jolting people out of their complacency. They had a very acute awareness of their built environment in a lot of ways. Not only does it kind of show up in their overall sound and aesthetic, but they do some very specific stuff commenting on how they inhabited it and certain things about it. For instance, they had one single, the cover of which was a picture of like a British military installation, and they took a picture of this and used it as a single cover to address their obsession with taboos and things that you weren't allowed to say. The reason this particular building related to that was because in England at the time, it was actually literally illegal to photograph this building for any reason whatsoever. So they just did that not as an act of defiance, kind of along the punk lines, and also as just kind of a commentary on the fact that it was a part of the built environment that you were not even allowed to acknowledge in certain degrees, much less record and distribute any documentation of it. So I think they did a lot of stuff like that. I just find that really kind of fascinating from a band that is so embedded in its environment and kind of commenting on it to that degree. They have another infamous performance where they played a show at a college and sought to really understand the idea of what a concert is. So kind of here's what they did. Unfortunately, there's no existing documentation of this event, so it's just relayed verbally at this point in history. They built a small room out of this like plywood, just cheap materials, and they built this box essentially, and they performed inside of it. There were no windows, there was no way to see inside the box, but it was not soundproof, so you could hear the performance, and so people could stand around this box and listen to them. However, so people could get a visual, they ran a closed-circuit TV loop to a monitor all the way on the other side of this university campus, so people could go and watch on the monitor. But the closed-circuit TV did not have sound, so the audience had to either choose between hearing them or seeing them. So not only is this kind of a deliberate attack on the idea of what a live performance was, it utilized construction, the environment, space, in these really precise and intentional ways to that end. It's been told that the audience reacted very badly to this. People were infuriated at the idea that they could either see or hear but could not do both. And the ultimate result was people attacking the box and throwing things at it. At one point, according to the band, people literally threw a toilet on top of it, trying to break a hole into it. So that is just one example of the many performances. They did a lot of things like this. They had a lot of unusual antics. I'm just going to dive deep into some of that and examine it and just kind of see what there is that helps make my argument as far as like a contrast to the band, this very aware environment, very intentional this, versus bands as genres that are responding to and being shaped by their environment in more implicit ways. Cabaret Voltaire from Sheffield is another interesting example. They came around about the same time as Throbbing Gristle. They evolved kind of independently of each other and had a sort of similar sound and approach, though they're both kind of very distinct in other ways. Sheffield at the time was a very decaying industrial city, even more so than London. A lot of abandoned factories, a lot of kind of old warehouses, things left open for squats. Cabaret Voltaire was very aware of this environment as well. And they did things like actually recording sounds from factories, recording old machinery, using in their performances, saying they explicitly wanted to make some music that kind of had the sounds of that environment, but conveyed it in a much more literal and direct way. So another examination and critique and analysis of the environment they're inhabiting in a really kind of like precise, like intentional manner. So that's just kind of another example of that. They have fewer infamous incidents in Throbbing Gristle, but they have kind of simpler things going on, and there's a lot of material out there to work with as well. Now, those are two bands in England. Stuff was going on in America at the time, and the chapter is going to cover that. Survival Research Labs was kind of a performance art group that was focused on not on music, though they did have soundtracks to their performance, making very large machines and having machines basically fight each other in arenas. They built like giant flamethrowers, things that shot 2x4s, sound cannons that created like blue rippling beams in the air. It's really unusual, bizarre stuff, and they decorated them with all kinds of strange, grotesque sculptures. Each machine was kind of a character, a performance. So it is very much like performance art, performative dance, stuff like that. And instead of humans doing it, it's all machinery. And it has like these kind of ambient, noisy soundtracks to it. And they all kind of worked on broad, vague concepts. The thing about Survival Research Labs, which is interesting in relation to the overall thesis, is not only their continued kind of explicit analysis of their environment and how they work on some of these themes, but also San Francisco contrasted with other places that I'm analyzing. I mentioned before that in terms of punk and indie rock, the San Francisco scene was a lot artsier, a bit older than, say, the LA hardcore scene, so it's got a very different character. So Survival Research Labs, Monte Cazaza, and the stuff that was going on in San Francisco is kind of a good illustration of that, about how the punk and goth and indie scenes in San Francisco intermingled with all this kind of much more artsy stuff. It's much more like, I know, stuff out of like university art department and stuff like that. Things that were, I don't like using the term necessarily, things that were a little more highbrow, for like a better way of putting it. So that's going to be the relevance to the argument there, because this is like a really, this particular genre is an example of how San Francisco is different from a lot of other scenes. A lot of stuff going on there, and even though bands like Throbbing Gristle and Cabaret Voltaire originating in England, they found a much bigger audience and a much bigger press outlet in San Francisco, where it seems like they kind of got their biggest like appreciation there. And I'm going to cover a handful of other first wave acts like Zev, SPK was out of Australia, Rhythm and Noise was like a weird kind of video audio group. Joanna Wendt was a performance artist who did all this costume thing. There's not enough of them to like have a dedicated subsection, but at least some mention of them, some examination of what they were all about. Then the next part of the industrial chapter is going to be a new genre emerges. These bands never sought out to create a new genre of music and often push back on the idea that they were a coherent genre, even more so than like punk ever did. Nevertheless, a lot of people like this stuff. They like the idea, so they picked it up and ran with it. And you get kind of a second wave of industrial in the very early 80s. There are going to be a few bands I cover. Test Department, early KFDM. There is a lot of stuff here, but the one that I'm specifically focused on is Einstürzende Neubauten, who is a German band, and they take the approach of alternative music and its relationship to the built environment just to an entirely new level of just both approach, intent, and just kind of avant-garde weirdness. Einstürzende Neubauten is a German term that means collapsing new buildings. The term, it's...
Jason, can I ask
Yes.
you, what year is this?
This this is all spanning from about 1976 is when Throbbing Gristle forms. They break up in 1981. Then the second wave starts in 81 with Neubauten releasing their first album.
That's what I wanted to know. Neubauten was 81. Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Yes, Neubauten was 81. No. I should say Neubauten. The name means collapsing new buildings. The term Neubauten, though, it doesn't just mean new buildings. It's got some specific connotations in Germany. Neubauten were new buildings built specifically after World War II. A lot of new architecture came up very quickly after the war because they had to rebuild fast. And a lot of the new buildings from World War II onward were regarded as being kind of cheaper, flimsy, or just kind of less well built, as opposed to Altbauten, which were kind of the pre-war buildings, which encompasses pretty much everything built like in German history up till that point, which we're seeing as sturdier, more well-made, and so forth. So not only does that division exist in kind of a dialectic of architecture in Germany, but this band adopts that division and makes it part of a musical concept. So this idea of new structures being kind of flimsier, playing into this idea of decay that you're seeing in a lot of Europe at the time, the decaying industrial environment in the 1970s and 1980s. So Neubauten kind of takes that and they run with it. They take the industrial sound and they strip it down even further. So while Throbbing Gristle and Cabaret Voltaire were still using electric guitars and synthesizers, Neubauten, as you can see from this picture here, gets a little more creative. They actually destroy things. They use pipes, oil drums. They would cut oil drums in half and make them to a bass drum. They used a jet engine in one concert and actually turned it on. Large industrial machinery, sometimes just beating it up, sometimes actually running it like to make sounds. As they had a very large lineup. I think at one point as many as 14 people in the band on stage doing stuff with all this like industrial refuse and machinery, and like just the performance itself is an embodied idea about destroying the built environment, about its fragility, about using things that aren't made to be instruments, using things from their built environment to make music. And it just all emerges into this chaotic cacophony of sound. Like, just literal books have been written on this band alone, and there's just a lot to go into here with Neubauten and how they relate this argument about not just the built environment shaping music genres, but the rare times when like the genres and musicians themselves like kind of push back and hit back, in this case literally against the environment they're inhabiting. Test Department is another early one. I'm going to go over them a little bit because they're relevant to how the second wave emerged. Then this subsection is going to go beyond England and Europe, because industrial started primarily as a European phenomenon, but then it moves to the United States, and you get wax tracks makers in Chicago. It starts to take more musical and less avant-garde approach. It starts to blend more with dance music, and the chapter will be capped off with a thing about how goth and industrial collide. So my kind of real quick run through of that concept is, as industrial becomes more of a conventional music genre, you have more conventional, more concerts, more club nights, more record stores, but it's still a very small and niche genre. Goth rock was emerging at the same time, and they shared a lot of the fan base. Goth industrial fans were really into a lot of the same things. If you look at that second picture of Blix Bargeld, he's got a very kind of gothy, kind of strappy looking uniform with all the belts, the priest collar. So goth and industrial already shared a bit of an audience, and they didn't have the economic base to each maintain their own separate spaces. There were dedicated goth clubs, there were dedicated industrial events, but they weren't drawing enough people to keep them afloat. So what happened is just necessity, because the two were kind of a fit, they started drifting together. So clubs would do goth and industrial nights where they played both types of music. Goth industrial band would tour together. The two genres, well, the two fandoms and the spaces started to converge. The fandom started to converge even more, and eventually the music itself converges, with goth music taking on more industrial qualities in terms of sound, and industrial music taking on more goth aesthetics and themes. And then you get like goth industrial, and then that happens at about the middle to the end of the 80s, and by the early 90s, goth and industrial are almost completely intertwined, to the point that by the end of the 90s, the beginning of the early 2010s, they're almost totally indistinguishable. They've only begun to separate in the last 5 or 10 years, and there have been intentional examples of old industrial have like the intermingling musical influences. So that, I think, is an interesting thing to think about in terms of my thesis and my argument, because we have an instance of the environment and the economics of the environment forcing two genres to occupy a much tighter proximity than any of the other genres do, and how that influences its evolution as a musical sound and a subculture. So, and that will kind of cap off that industrial chapter. And that itself kind of concludes my overview of what I'm doing with this chapter and how I'm going to use these, not just a specific chapter, but what my overall approach to making the argument chapter by chapter is going to be. And I did not notice till just now that Spaces is behind that picture.
That's okay.
Sorry, what did you say?
Please don't make me repeat all of that.
No, that last comment, something.
I just mentioned the picture is over top of a word in my PDF. I didn't notice that till just now. I just happened to see it as I kind of ended my whole spiel.
Okay, that's all right. What do you cover a fair bit of territory when you talk about this, and I'm guessing your colleagues are surprised and enlightened. They might not be as aware of the various musical quasi-underground genres as you, and it's a kind of fascinating overview for me. Because I know a little bit of these. I know some of these bands. Mm-hmm.
Industrial seems to be, of all those genres I'm covering, industrial seems to be the one that people in general kind of have the least familiarity with. It had its big moment in the 90s, but seems to have kind of faded from public consciousness since then.
Where do you put Bauhaus, Kraftwerk, and Front 242 in this lineup? Do you consider them? Are they coming out of it?
Highly regarded as being the first goth rock, though they personally always denied that. That's in the big scene. So I see them as goth and art rock, and they kind of influence post-punk and industrial. Then we get into the whole issue of post-punk itself, which is like not a genre but a huge umbrella term. So I place Bauhaus at the beginning of goth, and that's where my goth chapter is going to mostly start after I get all of like the backstory and influences out of the way. Front 242 is like EBM, so electronic binding music. So they're kind of second, third wave industrial. Again, they didn't like to be called industrial. They liked to be called EBM. That's the thing. Industrial specifically, you have a large number of bands who like to deny that they are a part of the genre, and they're like, no, we're actually, and then they give you some term that they probably made up themselves. But Front 242 is like the evolution. I see them as mostly kind of the emblematic band of the evolution of industrial into a form of dance music, along with Skinny Puppy and Frontline Assembly. So that's where I place them.
Okay.
Kraftwerk is, that one is super complicated because they predate all of this, and they're kind of, Kraftwerk's really kind of one of the progenitors of a lot of electronic music in general, of a lot of quote-unquote alternative quasi-underground music. They're very important to industrial, they're important to techno, to dance music. Kraftwerk's one of those bands, and I'll definitely be addressing them at some point, but they're so big because they're so early, and they've got so much influence on everything. In terms of genre, I kind of see them as genuinely in a class all their own, in a way that very few musical acts can actually claim to be.
And I know they're a little bit outside the general genre of punk and the movements that grew out of it. But someone like Tangerine Dream, do you tie them lightly to industrial or not?
Absolutely, yes. Because with Tangerine Dream, they're less purely electronic than Kraftwerk at times. Maybe, I mean, they've got their ambient experimental side, they've got their more conventional side, then they've got the soundtrack sort of side. But I do kind of tie them to industrial. So if I were to, because this all gets into like the implicit musical foundations of industrial. One book I'm using is called Assimilate, Critical History of Industrial Music, and it gets into kind of how industrial emerged from other genres of music implicitly rather than explicitly. So you don't have garage rock directly leading to punk. You don't have an equivalent of that industrial. Instead, you have kind of a sort of a cultural zeitgeist of things that were floating around that sort of like indirectly influences industrial. So you've got Kraftwerk, you got Tangerine Dream, you got Hawkwind, Silver Apples, you have like avant-garde like Philip Glass and Stockhausen and Lamonte Young. So all of that kind of influences industrial because I think two big reasons. One, they pioneer the use of various electronics in both pop and classical music. The second one is all of them in their various ways did their part to break the idea of what music, again, both pop and classical, could be what it had to be. I mean, I didn't necessarily have to be anything. John Cage has obviously got some relevance here as well. So that's kind of where I place those. They all kind of stand alone, but they're part of kind of a broader, sort of non-coordinated movement that kind of revolutionized what could be used to make music and what music could be. So that's kind of where things like Tangerine Dream and Kraftwerk and like some, as well as these avant-garde kind of more academic composers like Steve Reich and stuff like that sort of fit into this.
Right. I think that and Tangerine Dream went into making soundtracks and stuff like that, right?
Mm-hmm. And one, no, sorry.
I just want to tell you, I saw Hawkwind at the Gaumont Theatre in Ipswich, England in 1976.
That is freaking amazing. How was that?
I thought you'd be impressed.
Yes.
And, you know, that's, I mean, then they were kind of an important band for us. I was obviously living in England at the time, but, you know, pretty obscure today. Another kind of, not peripheral figure, very important figure, but maybe, you know, comes from a mainstream group, but did avant-garde work, is Brian Eno with his ambient sound records. Do you think he influenced some of these? It seems to me he would have influenced some of these people.
Absolutely. I mean, he pretty much single-handedly created the idea of ambient music, rock music, and Eno are sometimes mentioned in some of these interviews. So yeah, he is just definitely an important influence as well.
I think music for films and music for airports was pretty important. Were pretty important records.
Mm-hmm. And even like his like kind of production and behind the scenes work with Roxy music, they always had a different quality, which can be attributed to like his more, again, I don't like to use the term, but his slightly more highbrow influence on some of this stuff. And I kind of left it out in my whole rundown, but an important thing about the industrial chapter and compared to the other genres is, like, unlike some of the other genres I'm covering, the industrial art. So like a lot of things like punk was kind of famous for being like excuse me, a working class thing, especially in England. Even a more skilled and intellectual punks were kind of more self-taught. They were more autodidactic. Industrial in particular, and a lot of the stuff with connections to the more electronic stuff, they were more often art students. They were people who had gone to college, whereas people in a lot of these other like musical genres, that was not necessarily the case. But almost all of these people were art students. Throbbing Gristle very much came from like the gallery world. Monte Cazaza was like, it wasn't like. It wasn't it wasn't Berkeley, or it was some art school in San Francisco. But like a lot of these people very much came out of more of an academic background.
And I think you look at the influence of Brian Eno on both Talking Heads and David Byrne in particular. Now that's moving forward quite a bit, and maybe that's outside the scope of your work, but it's you know, he spanned a long period of time, Brian Eno. I think he's been pretty interesting.
Completely outside the scope, like that gets more into like new wave in general as a larger social movement, which is like a big, complicated topic of itself. I'm going to touch on that, but like it's a little harder to address that because new wave was less of a specific thing than punk or goth or industrial work, because it's like post-punk. It's more of like an umbrella term, so it's harder to make like a precise analysis the way you do with some of the others.
And just one final question comment is that, you know, Laurie Anderson also dovetails into some of those early days of new wave. I also saw her live. She's pretty fantastic, and she was married to Lou Reed, of course.
Yeah, when you bring up Lou Reed, I'm sure you probably heard Metal Machine music, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's another important this with industrial, with electronic music, and then there's a subgenre / spin-off genre called noise music, and like Metal Machine music is just really important to this. One book I'm working on is called the Industrial Culture Handbook. It's from a company called Research Publications. They were out of San Francisco, and I'm going to do a whole thing on them in my final result. Research is, they started out doing zines, then they became a book publisher. They talked about punk, industrial, weird trash movies, like pranks, modern primitivism in terms of tattoos and like body modification, and a lot of like what became like alternative culture. Research kind of really were one of the first to comprehensively promote all of it in the 70s and 80s in San Francisco, and they're a big reason San Francisco had that different character I was talking about. That the relevance here specifically to like Lou Reed and Eno is that the Industrial Culture Handbook, like a lot of the other books research put out, are interview books. We'll interview a specific band, and at the end of every chapter, we'll give a list of albums, books, movies that inspire the artists or performers they're interviewing. Like in those lists are a lot of recurring things. Lou Reed, Metal Machine music, those show up a lot. Brian Eno, Roxy music, those show up in the list of recommended bands and albums that these people say inspire them. John Cage and John Cale are both common ones. Leonard Cohen, especially his poetry more so than his writing, is a common one. Again, back to William Burroughs, he's citing a lot. That's just a little side note I want to say. Some of the sources I'm working off of involve these bands giving lists of their influences, and almost all like the stuff you brought up and talked about are listed at various parts as things that influence these artists.
Well, let's talk about where you're going to go with this and what the different options for things you can do. I'm interested in tying it back, however loosely, to our discipline. And I think the vehicle that's most appealing is, there's two that are most appealing to me. There's the kind of push-pull between these musical genres and movements, and how they begin to shape culture and the things that they impacted that have become mainstream. And, you know, one might not necessarily realize that. And then there's the, and you talked about last time we spoke, you talked about Malcolm McLaren and how he commodified punk, and
Yes.
he was a kind of he was an astute enough businessman to understand that he had a product to market, and just like we see any movie that's released for a kid, it has toys and cups and clothes, and all the other things. It's no different in a way. He was just earlier to the table, and
I'm a little bit opinionated about him because there's mixed views on him as a problematic figure with the ways he treated Vivienne Westwood and how he did this, but that's a whole other topic in and of itself.
Okay, but I think that there's a discussion to be had. So one is culture, and from fashion to how we ornament our bodies with tattoos and piercings, very commonplace. Now, less so 30 years ago. And also there's the kind of physical places from which people emerged, and you have talked about that. And it's secondarily, it's the impact that, let's say, the socio-economic political landscape had on the built environment, and how some kids emerged from that and critiqued it. And it's funny, I think it was the 50th anniversary of the Black Sabbath Paranoid album last week, and there was a little story on NPR about it.
Oh, nice.
And it was interesting because they talked about, I want to say they were from Manchester, but I don't know if that's true. But they talked about coming out of Manchester at that time. And they were I'm not a Black Sabbath guy, so I don't really know a lot about their lyrics, but one person they were interviewing talked about the fact that they were really politically relevant in terms of the presence of the bomb and the fear of nuclear war and things like that in the 60s. And we have to remember, the mid to late 60s were just not that far removed from World War II and Hiroshima and Nagasaki, really. So, and I was a kid then, so I was, I had to duck and shelter or duck and cover or whatever it was in the hallways when I was in elementary school. And so I'm thinking that if you can, I mean, you're a kind of walking encyclopedia of knowledge, and it's really how you apply this and how you arrange it, and what connections do you make that haven't been made. And I think they lie in the built environment, and they lie in culture, in so much as culture comes back and haunts architecture, and architecture is part of culture, and it's both architecture is both a cultural construction and a kind of technological construction. It kind of has a foot in both camps and to different degrees at different times. It's it's like before there was deconstruction in architecture, there was postmodern, and there was structural theory, and architecture is a great co-opter of things. But it also has its own history and logic that it, in my opinion, should continue to draw from. I don't like it when architecture delves into fashion, which it does from time to time. And sometimes theory becomes fashion. We kind of borrow heavily from certain things. It may be interesting, but I don't know how that it necessarily serves the discipline long term. But anyway, I'm kind of wondering how you tie it back, as I say, however loosely, to our discipline, because I think you're perfectly capable of doing that. And I think that would be kind of exciting. And the other thing, and this is completely another issue, is that I think it's real important that you have many, 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 many images and links to video. And I think you need to kind of make yours a very visual document. I would have liked to have looked at about 100 images while you were talking earlier, because it's a visual time. It's a visual discipline. Better. Yeah, and I think your document will live as a hard copy document, but it will also live online as a live document. And I think linking things to videos that are readily available online, performances, even documentaries, you know, your documentaries about the rise of punk in England. I mean, I just think it's going to be really interesting for you. It'll be a kind of history lesson using music as a tool to understand culture that impacted architecture at that time. And if you can begin to make connections between architectural sensibilities, just have as you have with music sensibilities, that'll be fascinating. Like, look at if for some reason I looked at Milton Keynes, which is about an hour north of London, and it was a big deal planned community in the early 60s. And I knew of a couple of buildings there, but I didn't really know the plan well. And it is a planned community. It's phenomenal. I mean, it's really, really interesting. So, and I think England was very interesting. England post-war in the 60s was really fascinating in terms of both theoretical work and what got built. Like, one of you guys was referring to Archigram or Archizoom or one of these. It might have been Jerry, I don't know. But what I found interesting is a lot of things were steeped in housing and development because so much of the fabric of London and other cities had been bombed during World War II. So there was a rebuilding of England, a very, very, I mean, all of Europe for that matter, but talking about England. So I think that you know, Milton Keynes really surprised me when I looked at it. And so we're still, you know, in a sense reconstructing. You know, you talked about the reconstructing of Germany, which was a, you know, profound undertaking. But when you think about the reconstructing of England too, I think that's a kind of an important phenomenon. And I think these things can kind of dovetail a little bit to inform what you're doing, because I think, again, you know, if you can tie it to the rise of brutalism in England, if you can tie it to the kind of the revisiting of majestic, overreaching plans, which certainly happened in England and the United States, but maybe so in England, more so in England. If you can tie it to the rise of postmodernism as a critique of the modern movement, the failures of the modern movement, particularly the failures of planning, which, you know, all of which begin in Europe, but more specifically England. Social housing, the critique of social housing. You know, if you remember the film Trainspotting, I think it takes place in Glasgow mostly, and you see the presence of social housing is really important in that film. And social housing is, it was very common for people to live in government council housing. This is another thing they called it, where the town council owned the housing. It never had the stigma that social housing had in the United States. My grandparents lived on one side of my family, lived in council housing, and still do to this day, actually. My grandparents lived in it, and my aunt lives in it. And they're perfectly beautiful row houses. And sometimes, you know, during the Thatcher years, which should play your research and music, during the Thatcher and consequently Reagan years, which again steps a little bit outside punk, but not a lot. England, you know, the socialized England of the 50s and 60s gave way to the selling off of state-owned things such as housing, such as British Air. That was a state-owned airline. The telephone company was state-owned, and all those things went public, and there were stock offerings, and you were guaranteed to make money the day it came out. And my uncle and his best friend were hardcore members of the National Socialist Party long before it became popular in Scotland and the UK, and they would not buy any of this stock because they believed they should be public utilities. So I think there's a lot of things going on, not just with youth, but with a certain segment of the professional the professional class and the working class. My uncle was a schoolmaster. He taught Latin and was a schoolmaster for years. He's retired now, but there were kind of ethical positions about the role of the state in your life, and we see this being revisited very gently here by Bernie Sanders and what's her name, OCA, is that it?
Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez.
Yeah, and AOC, is it? Yeah. And those are treading waters that freak a lot of people out. But even Obamacare was so controversial. And if you break a leg in Britain, you'll be taken care of. You won't. I was in Scotland a couple of years ago, and I actually messed up my leg pretty badly, and I went to the emergency room, and it did everything they needed to do, and gave me some Tylenol or something, and I said, okay, what do I owe you? And she just kind of smiled and said, nothing. And I said, this would have been a $700 visit in the United States at least. And so, the social network and the kind of instruments of society are part and parcel with a lot of things you're looking at. And I'm kind of rambling here, but I'm fascinated by your research. And I think that you've got the kind of musical the way the musical movements are intertwined. You've got that down cold. I'm really interested in where they take you, how you pull in other things, very selectively, I would say. And I hope you can find a way to look at phenomena of the built environment. And I think England's a really good place to do that.
So I just to restate a bit of that I think is super important. It's one thing to be an expert at something, which you definitely are, and in a way that very few people are an expert on anything, probably in the entire world. But the real talent when it comes to communicating the broader message, is the ability to take that knowledge and contextualize it. So if you can place this, like Bob is saying, alongside, inside, or along the trajectory of movements as they've been defined or are understood in a general sense in architecture and in politics and housing and things like that, then the thing will really start to take on a meaning that is more significant than just the catalog of specialty knowledge, but rather as a broader social commentary, and also broader commentary within the context of architecture and design. And all I did there, I just said what Bob said. But
No, I get you. So I've been writing down, I've been seeing or typing down a lot of what Bob has said, because there's some, in addition, a lot of good ideas. There's some very quotable parts, like I love culture haunts architecture, and I just think that itself is great. And definitely have a lot to say about tying it to architectural movements, especially the rise of postmodernism. I think there's a lot there to talk about. I know we're coming up on the hour too, and I know everyone goes on the top of each hour, right? So, yeah.
Let me give you a book to look at if you don't have it already. It's a theory book. It's called Theorizing a New Agenda for Architectural Theory. Or Theorizing a New Agenda for Architecture, an Anthology for Architectural Theory. The author is Kate Nesbitt.
I've got that on my Amazon to buy list, actually.
Go ahead and buy it. It's not an expensive book. It's soft, it's paperback. It goes from 1965 to 95, but I think the first 10 years, 65 to 75, are more important for you. And what she does is she summarizes a chapter and each article. She gangs a series of articles together that push and pull against one another, basically over a time period, but also a theoretical topic. And then she summarizes each article briefly, so you know what you're going to read before you read it. The articles are short, and then she tells you what you just read and puts it back into context. And it's a great primer for theory, but it's also a great handbook when you kind of want to just grasp some things quickly. And I think some of the things emerging in the early and mid 60s that go ahead and 70s for that matter, that influence punk, the rise of punk, will be really fascinating. I think you, if anyone, can make connections if they're there to be made.
Cool. Yeah, I'll definitely do that. I'll add that to my next order because I got a couple other books I want to get for this whole project in general. So I'll do that as soon as possible.
Okay, good. I think it'll help.
Thank you.
That was pretty riveting for me.
Oh yeah.
There's just so much there.
Yeah, I know. It's gonna, like, and all the chat was gonna be like, it's gonna be very information dense in the end.
Yes. Yes, it is.
And this was a very trimmed version of what I could have said too.
Oh, I know.
I think one of your struggles is going to be how you present this in a short enough period of time to give people a chance to discuss it.
Yeah.
The short form delivery, it's the art form. You have to really bring your conclusions forward, show the implications as obviously as possible, show that contextualization and fill in, the other kinds of details as the questions come out. It's a big project.
Yeah, I mean, and this took, I think my going through it took nearly 30 or 40 minutes, and that was with abbreviating a lot of what I said the last time too. So I know I'm going to have to take a very specific approach to my final presentation, or else you could go on forever.
I think we need to do a dry run at least once.
Yeah, I can see
the week
that.
Before. And I would enjoy being a part of that, Mark, if you guys decide to do that.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And
yes,
probably
definitely.
Also, if you can get whatever you have done of the document by the time you come up to the final, we should send not just the summary to the critics, but the whole thing.
That could be.
They can read it if they want to.
Yeah.
You need to think about final critics. It's going to be like today, a single day, and we can kind of bang, 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 go through everyone. This is a really good dry run. And let's think about who we want, Mark, for the final. And
okay.
For those of you, the students sitting in, let us know who you want so I can start to ask people now, because, people's calendars are filling quickly with this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And we're going to be, on Teams. I don't see us varying from that. So, and you guys are good at it now, so we're all used to it. So, so just drop me a note if there's some people you want me to try to get.
Hey, cool.
Okay.
All right, thank you.
Okay, I'm going to hop off. I've got a couple of other things, and I'm back on for Ardits at, is it 4 o'clock or 3 o'clock, Ardit? Are you out there?
Bob,
it's at 4 o'clock.
4, okay.
I'm going to have to challenge you on your statement, your blanket statement about architecture and fashion, and how that definitely needs to be unpacked. That's a whole conversation with beer right there.
Yeah, I was thinking that too.
Architecture is not a dress or a suit.
Oh man,
or a meal.
I guess it depends on how you're talking about it. Okay, it's not a meal, but it's so delicious.
Like a bitter modernist, I'm talking about it.
That's a cocktail.
Architecture is definitely a meal.
It is.
No, what I'm saying is I don't like architecture to be consumed and discarded as a.
Oh, I see. So it's not that you disagree with architect being in fashion or like designing garments or something like that. It's
no. I think Frank Gehry's done some fine jewelry.
Bob, have you ever heard of Rick Owens?
Rick Owens, I'm not sure. Doesn't ring a bell.
We should have a conversation about that one day. He's a fashion designer who's very influenced by brutalism specifically, and he's just a really interesting figure to look at in terms of his aesthetics.
Oscar Schlemmer in the Bauhaus did these costumes for theater that were bizarre and extraordinary. I mean, there's a long history of the intertwining of these things, and I've just been very interested in the Bauhaus. This really from last year was the 100th anniversary to now, and I'm still kind of digging around and finding things. And Yeah, I mean, it's what's interesting, and I'll get off here because I know that I don't want to delay the next thing, but we have a new dean who's very interested in architecture. He's a designer and a painter, but he's very interested in fronting architecture a little more self-consciously in the school because he sees it as just a really important discipline along with all the design pieces. And I think historically design is doesn't really interest the fine artists, and it's kind of dismissed a bit sometimes. And he's quite the opposite. He's done web design, he's worked in industry, he's been in academics for a long time, and he's just interested in design. We've had some really good meetings and discussions. So he does see it as, and he sort of sees architecture as I don't know what term he used, the umbrella or the the mother or father or whatever terminology you want to use, but as something that kind of binds a lot of so-called design under the design umbrella. Anyway, that's another conversation. I really enjoyed these 2 reviews, and I'll check back in later today. And good luck to all of you. I appreciate you participating so actively, and I would encourage you to weigh in with questions and comments the rest of the day.
Thank you for coming.
My pleasure. We'll talk to you guys soon.
All right, Bob.
Bye-bye.
Okay. Who's next?